marriage, the most sacred of relationships, yet time and life make it fragile. Love, trust, respect, and desire, all elements of a successful marriage. Yet so many of us along the way forget. We lead busy lives. We go through changes, big and small. We build walls to protect ourselves. It does not have to be this way. There are clear and exciting ways to bring your marriage and life back on track. Welcome to the Couples Expert Podcast with Stuart Fensterheim.
Just gonna stand there and watch me burn, but that's all right because I like the way it hurts. Just gonna stand there and hear me cry, but that's all right because I love the way you lie. I love the way you lie. I can't tell you what it's really like. I can only tell you what it feels like. And right now, there's a steel knife in my windpipe. I can't breathe, but I still fight while I can fight. As long as the wrong feels right, it's like I'm in a flight, high off of love, drunk from my hate. It's like I'm huffing paint, and I love the more that I suffer. I suffocate, and right before I'm about to drown, she resuscitates me. She fucking hates me. And I love it. Wait. Where are we going? I'm leaving you. No, you ain't. Come back. We're running right back. Here we go again. It's so insane. When it's going good, it's going great. I'm Superman with the wind at my back. She's Lois Lane. But when it's bad, it's awful. I feel so ashamed. I snapped. Who's that dude? I don't even know his name. I laid hands on her. I'll never stoop so low again, I guess. I don't know my own strength. Just gonna stand there and watch me burn, but that's all right because I like the way it hurts. Just gonna stand there and hear me cry, but that's all right because I love the way you lie. I love the way you lie. You ever love someone so much you can barely breathe? When you're with them, you meet, and neither one of you even know what hit them. Got that warm, fuzzy feeling, yeah, them chills used to get them, but now you're fucking sick of looking at them. You swore you'd never hit them, never do nothing to hurt them. Now you're in each other's face, spewing venom in these words when you spit 'em. You push, pull each other's hair, scratch, claw, bit 'em. Throw 'em down, pin 'em, so lost in the moments when you're in 'em. It's the rage that's the culprit. It controls you both. So as they say, it's best to go your separate ways. Guess they don't know you, 'cause today, that was yesterday. Yesterday is over, it's a different day. Sound like a broken record, playing over, but you promised her. Next time you'll show restraint. You don't get another chance. Life is no Nintendo game, but you lied again. Now you get to watch her leave, out of the window. Guess that's why they call it window pane. Just gonna stand there and watch me burn. But that's all right, because I like the way it hurts. Just gonna stand there and hear me cry. But that's all right, because I love the way you lie. I love the way you lie. Now, I know we said things, did things that we didn't mean, and we fell back into the same patterns, same routine. But your temper's just as bad as mine is. You're the same as me, but when it comes to love, you're just as blinded. Baby, please come back. It wasn't you. Baby, it was me. Maybe our relationship isn't as crazy as it seems. Maybe that's what happens when a tornado meets a volcano. All I know is I love you too much to walk away now. Come inside. Pick up your bags off the sidewalk. Don't you hear sincerity in my voice when I talk? Told you it's my fault. Look me in the eyeball. Next time I'm pissed, I'll aim my fist at the drywall. Next time there'll be no next time. I apologize, even though I know it's lies. I'm tired of the games. I just want her back. I know I'm a liar. If she ever tries to fucking leave again, I'm gonna tie her to the bed and set the house on fire. Just gonna stand there and watch me burn. But that's all right, because I like the way it hurts. Just gonna stand there and hear me cry. But that's all right, because I love the way you lie. I love the way you lie. Those are the lyrics to Eminem's I Love the Way You Lie. Scary, isn't it? And I think the concept that most of us have is people who are caught up into this are socioeconomically struggling, that it's men and women that come from poor backgrounds, What I would suggest to you, though, is that craziness, that internal dialogue, the horrible thoughts, the beliefs, the negative interpretations, the loving the way you lie holds true through all classes, including you and I, upper class, middle class, and lower class. Domestic violence is not something that here at the Couples Expert we talk a lot about. It actually is a contraindication to the work we do. But one of the commitments that I made this year was to talk about the things that never get talked about. And that's what today's about. We're not going to be addressing this, and if you go online, or if you go all over the place, you see article after article talking about the cycle of violence, talking about the way that people need to really have a more positive approach to having enough food on the table, and Obamacare, and all the things that needs to be done for the homeless. Those are the clients that most anger management programs cover. What isn't talked about enough is the domestic violence from wealthy, affluent families. That's the silent minority, or maybe even a majority. But how do we talk about that? Who knows what goes on into the homes of people with affluence? The heads of CEOs, the heads of Fortune 500 companies, people making $100 million a year. They always put out this list of the wealthiest people in the country. And we look at that list and we go, oh, I just wish that was us. We'd have no problems. What I would suggest is what goes on behind those closed doors could be as horrible as any horror movie you ever wanted to see. Let me give you some statistics. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims of some form of violence by intimate partners. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have been victims of severe violence by intimate partners. 20,000 phone calls about domestic violence are made to crisis hotlines on a daily basis, and that's just an average. The presence of a gun increases the likelihood of homicide by 500%. 19% of all domestic violence involves a weapon. So how does this happen? What occurs that turns two people who fell in love, care about each other, love each other, want to have a life together, and then ultimately it turns so incredibly wrong to the point where we grab each other, push each other, and we smack each other around? What would create a loving relationship turning violent, and then people feel scared for their own life? What I would suggest to you, it isn't just about control. It isn't about wanting to hurt. It actually is about feeling scared of losing someone. If you reflect on the words of the song at the beginning of this podcast, you heard the contradiction in the feelings of wanting someone, being afraid of losing you, and then rather quickly turning into, I'm going to knock you out to keep you close. The primal panic that comes over people when it comes to an intimate relationship is pretty horrible. Feeling alone in this world, there's nothing worse than that. Feeling that you're losing your love object, there's nothing worse than that. Feeling that you don't measure up to your partner, there's nothing worse than that. Feeling that your partner would rather be anywhere but by your side, there's nothing worse than that. So what you see is a countless need that's not being taken care of. So if as a couple, what you do is create a situation in which you and your partner always understand how important you are to one another and that you have each other's back in a real way, authentically, that you talk about the things that come up, you talk about the things that matter to you, you talk about the fear of losing someone this important. Those are some of the things that happen. I want to be clear about something. What I just shared doesn't excuse the behavior, doesn't make it appropriate or even anything close to healthy, or doesn't make the perpetrator who is hurting their partners not responsible for their behavior. Every one of us has to take accountability for how we treat our partners. We need to be in a relationship in which our partners see us as worthwhile and that they don't get to control what we do in a victimizing way. So if there's anyone listening out there that are in a relationship that has these issues, I am not saying that you should just excuse what your partner is doing. And I'm definitely not saying that just because your love object doesn't respond the way that you want it to, that it's okay to lay your hands on them. It is not. And you need to get help as an individual and also as a couple. Before we start talking about the issues with an affluent family, I want to talk about some of the universal issues. Back in the 1990s, Dr. Leonard Walker identified a very well-known concept called the cycle of violence. And she is really the pioneer in this. And what she began to talk about, and what the research has shown us, is that there's really 3 phases of this. So if you have a relationship that has these components of violence in the relationship, what we normally see is all 3 of these repeating over and over and over again. And the 3 phases are the following. The first one is the tension building phase. There's an increase in tension over very common issues that all couples have. Things like money, children, jobs. And then what ends up happening is there's a flip side that begins with some verbal abuse, some name calling. And name calling is in many relationships, but this is really very hostile, verbal, emotional abuse. And what happens is the person who is being victimized tries to control the situation by pleasing their abuser because they don't want this. They start giving in and avoiding things that will create this type of tension. None of these, however, generally stop anything. And eventually that tension reaches a boiling point, and that's when the physical abuse starts. And then during that second phase, which is an acute battering episode, the tension peaks and physical violence begins. And what it's usually triggered by is some sort of external event or the perpetrators, the emotional state. They get very upset, or they may be frustrated or irritated or scared, or they may have a problem at work. But this is the important piece. Generally, it's not by the victim's behavior. It's not by their partner's behavior. And this discomfort that comes with that from the perpetrator is unpredictable. Battering becomes unpredictable and beyond anyone's ability to control it. Once the violence happens, the third phase occurs, which is a honeymoon phase. And that's the phase that many people who have been in these kinds of relationships said, this is like a high. Because what happens is the person, the abuser, feels so remorseful and is ashamed of their behavior.
And generally, they turn to their partner and expresses this remorse, but at the same time is trying to minimize the abuse and might even say, but if you didn't do this, so there's a blame. And it's usually followed by a lot of apologies, a lot of generosity, a lot of loving behaviors that is craved by their partner. And there's a genuine attempt to convince the partner that the abuse won't happen again. And more often than not, the partner really wants to believe this and will probably feel so loved. And it does strengthen the bond at that stage between the partners. That's why I called it a high. It's sort of this fantasy world that is now here. This is what we've wanted. This is the relationship that we really needed. And then the partner who at one point thought, hey, I got to get out of this. I got to leave, convinces themselves that leaving is not necessary. This cycle continues over and over again and really does explain why a lot of abuse victims stay. But there is a wrinkle with the affluent families. But if we look at this as a general thing, it's something that happens whether you're affluent or low, this pattern will continue over and over and over again, giving the victim this false belief that everything's going to be okay now. My partner does see the problems, and it won't happen again. But it always does. And it repeats over and over and over again, like Groundhog Day. One of the things I'm going to have in my show notes for all of you is this power and control cycle of violence. And I'm going to have in the show notes the list of some of the behaviors of the partners so that you could really understand what this cycle looks like and how it works. But what I want to now talk about is the unique element that comes with affluent families. So let me give you a situation that has come to my office at some point. There was a couple that I saw a few years ago that basically was, the gentleman's name was Ross and his partner was Beth. They'd been married about 15 years. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Ross. Ross was the head of a Fortune 500 company. His income was at about $3.5 million in salary and bonuses. Now, Beth had stayed home because when they met and they realized that there's absolutely no reason that she would need to work, she stayed home to raise the children along with a live-in nanny that they had. And her focus was really on volunteering and really being there, helping the children, volunteering in the schools who went to private schools. And this couple reached out to me after a really horrible incident. There was some issue that arose at Ross's company in which they lost a major contract, and he was beside himself. And Beth really tried to sort of comfort him and reach out. And the trigger that occurred put Ross into this incredible rage. And at about 3 o'clock in the morning, they had been arguing and fighting, and the kids were in bed. Ross absolutely lost it. And he began to really throw Beth around a bit and ended up with grabbing her by her throat, started to strangle her. She was able to get away because there was one of the kids played baseball, and there was a baseball bat, and she struck him while he was grabbing her and tried to get away. She ran outside, fearing for her life, and he ran after her and was about to go into his car to try to run her over. And this was after she had threatened to leave him after he had grabbed her. Now think about this. think about that incident. Here's two people who truly care about each other and love each other, at least for the most part. And when the trigger occurs, they lose sight of everything. And Ross becomes this Jekyll and Hyde. And he was trying to kill, and he acknowledged this, that the rage inside of him did that. And it was the worst incident that they ever had. And luckily, Ross called me, and I had a message on my machine at about 3 o'clock in the morning. Because what they knew is that I had worked with high-profile clients, and that through my Facebook page, through my podcast, through the YouTube channel that I have, that I work with heads of large companies and have worked with race car drivers and newscasters, and that the high-profile confidentiality would exist. So he left out. Now, when I called Ross, he said, everything's fine now. We don't need help. And what luckily he had done, he had left me a pretty specific message that talked about the incident. And I reminded him of that and said, this isn't going to stop unless you get help. So the two of them did agree to come in. Now, what you should know about this situation is part of what had happened previously at another time for them is that Ross had threatened her to take the children and move to France, where his company had an office, and that she wouldn't ever see them again. And that these violent episodes were occurring more frequently every few months, including situations where, when he was really upset with her, he was a cigar smoker. He would burn her legs right by her thigh because he knew that it wouldn't show. So it was becoming more and more vicious. And he would severely apologize. So what would happen for Beth is what she would recognize is that she was stuck. She had given up her law practice, and it had been years now since she had worked. The kids were teenagers. And she felt like she was a prisoner in her own home, because if she left, he had the resources, he had a legal team. She was really a hostile kidnap victim. She was a victim in her own home, stuck, not very different than the horrible stories we sometimes hear of people who were hidden away in dungeons, sexually accosted, because part of what would occur at times, he would rape her. And she began to believe that this is the life and the only life that she could ever have. And that unless they get help, and who would get help, because he did not want his reputation to be one that this is a guy that victimizes his wife. So they're hidden away, living this really, really horrible existence. And fortunately, that phone call happened. And after working with this couple for about a year, they began to realize that they needed to start talking about the real issues. And anger management was part of that. Learning how to do effective timeouts were part of that. But that their situation has another element to it that no other kind of family has, which is when we talk about power and control, we're not usually talking about financial power and control. And we have to acknowledge that people with affluence, people that make this kind of income, there's a power structure that goes beyond anything a low economic family has to deal with, which is going from living a home in a mansion where you make $3.5 million, and now you're left with a resource of living in a box on the street or living in a shelter. People don't do that. So what I'm really saying is that these horrible situations are something that happens through all classes and all economics, but have some unique factors for the affluent families. And the premise is that you have to deal with the behaviors, you have to deal with the anger management, you have to deal with the power and control issues. But in order to really have this be something that changes within the structure of the marriage or relationship, unless you deal with the emotional connection pieces, you're never going to solve the problem. It's about a willingness to deal with your own fears, anxieties, and emptiness, but also as a couple, being able to work together to have an emotionally connected relationship where both of you feel safe, secure, and that you with someone that loves you. What we've done today in this podcast is talk about the population that the affluent families that most people don't talk about. But there's also another category, and that is when the man is the abused victim. That's something most people never talk about. And as I was doing some research for this podcast, found very little information on that. But what I want to do is make sure I can't end this podcast without mentioning that there is another element with a man who's being abused by his wife, and that men are not the only perpetrators. Men are not the only abusers. Women sometimes even more viciously abuse the men in their life. And when you have someone that's a CEO to a company that's making multi-million dollars a year, and they try to come forward and say, my wife is abusing me, people look at him and go, you're full of it, and is not believed. And it can be an even as horrible of a situation as the one that we just talked about. So I want to list some of what does abuse to a man look like. And here are some of the things that you want to think about. That when you started the relationship, your partner was sweet and loving and caring, and now she's jealous all the time. Not just of other women, but jealous of your time, jealous of your children, jealous of work, jealous of previous relationships, and that she wants to cut you off from all of your support network. That your partner, she puts you down. She started off so loving, but when you think about that, you barely recognize the person you're with. She's hypercritical, putting you down for everything you do. You feel isolated. She controls the money. You have no privacy. She goes through your phone. She wants all your passcodes. She won't ever let you have anything that's just for you. She emotionally blackmails you, whether she's threatening to kill herself or whether she's blackmailing you into staying, having to do with the kids. Here are some facts. Domestic violence against men. For every 3 victims of domestic violence, 2 will be female and 1 will be a male. In 2014, 2.8% of men, around 500,000 men, experience partner abuse. 29% keep the abuse secret. Male victims are twice as likely as women to keep it to themselves, because what does it suggest? That we're wimpy, we're big, we're strong, we work out, we do these things. What we're really talking about here in this entire podcast, and I want to really end with this, the thing that hurts families the most is silence. There is help out there. There are help for men and women who are victims of domestic violence. And so often, the problem is the police officers. If you go into a home and a man says, my wife abused me, they rarely respond appropriately. If it's the flip side and a woman says that, the man's being quartered away to jail. We need to make treatment and legal systems available to both genders, because nothing's more horrible to your family than a situation of two people loving each other, hurting each other in this way. I want to really thank all of you for joining me. I'm excited to be sharing this, and I really want all of you to be sending me emails to my email address that I want you to give me suggestions, ideas, what you would like to see on this podcast, topics for discussion, to podcast@thecouplesexperts.com. And we'll see you all next time, and please stay connected. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. This episode has ended, but your journey continues. Head over to www.thecouplesexperts.com to access all the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive to podcast listeners. Enjoyed this episode? Why not hit subscribe now and never miss an episode?